Why is alcohol use so widespread? From an evolutionary perspective, it's really weird because alcohol is a chemical intoxicant with a long list of negative effects. So you would think that cultures that prohibit drinking would dominate over drinking cultures, or that a genetic mutation that prevents drinking would spread widely through the population. That's the mystery that I discuss in the following conversation with Professor Edward Slingerland from the University of British Columbia. Edward wrote the book Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. He explains the functional benefits of alcohol that make it humanity's favorite intoxicant, and which may have even given rise to civilization itself. I'm Shane Farnsworth, and this is the Escape Sapiens podcast, supported by the Andrea von Braun Foundation. If you enjoy this content, you can have a direct impact on its success by liking, subscribing, and sharing. And now, here's Edward Slingerland. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
So let's begin with the mystery. All right, so I've taken it for granted that people drink alcohol. But why is it a surprise? Why is it somehow a mystery that needs explanation?
It's the consumption of chemical intoxicants in general and alcohol in particular is one of these things that I call a mystery hiding in plain sight, because we do take it for granted, right? You go to a new culture, you read about a new culture, and they welcome people with a banquet, and they bring out the alcohol. You read about treaty negotiations, and the first thing they all do is sit down and drink alcohol or drink coffee, some chemical equivalent if they don't have alcohol. What got me interested in this project is the thought that this is puzzling behavior, especially in the case of alcohol, because alcohol is so costly. Our taste for alcohol causes us to consume this liquid neurotoxin, that we have this machinery in our bodies dedicated to detoxifying ethanol and getting rid of it as quickly as possible, because it's a really harmful substance. It causes liver damage. It's a carcinogen. It's estimated that maybe as much as 15% of the population is genetically prone to alcohol use disorder. And if you have that disorder, you can't drink safely. You can drink to the point of incapacitating yourself, harming other people. As long as cultures have had alcohol, they've been worried about these problems and they've been trying to prohibit it. And there's been cultures have always had this very ambivalent attitude toward alcohol because it is a dangerous substance. And it's especially puzzling. So the central puzzle that I explore in the book is the fact that here's this costly behavior. The standard scientific story is, well, it's an evolutionary mistake. It's just a hijack of a reward system or a kind of evolutionary mismatch. But as I explained in the beginning of the book, that can't be true because we have very good genetic and cultural solutions to this mistake, if it's really a mistake. So there's a genetic mutation that causes what's sometimes called Asian flushing syndrome, where if you have this, it's a set of two mutations that actually aren't linked. So it's clearly being selected for at some level. If you have this mutation, when you consume ethanol, your face turns red, you get nauseous, you get heart palpitations. It's really unpleasant. So, one story about why we drink alcohol is, well, it makes us feel good. And well, why does it make us feel good? That's the question. The standard story is, well, no reason. It's just a mistake. But here, if it's a mistake, here's the solution. This genetic mutation is basically the solution to our taste for alcohol. And yet, at least in the East Asia case, it evolved, we think, about 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. See, it seems to be around the same time as rice agriculture. And yet it just sits there in East Asia. It spread a bit it probably started around modern day Shanghai, and it's since spread to Korea and Japan a bit, but it pretty much has just hung out in East Asia. And that's puzzling, because if alcohol is really just a costly evolutionary mistake, that mutation should have spread everywhere by now. And yet it's very geographically limited. Same thing with cultural evolution. So cultural evolution is much faster and in a lot of ways more powerful than genetic evolution. So what's the cultural solution to this problem? Just ban alcohol. And there are cultural groups who've tried this, and it just hasn't seemed to caught on. I don't have this in the book, but when I give talks on the topic, I show a map of the contemporary world and where either full or partial prohibition is actually in effect. And it's a very limited region, mostly in the Middle East. And it looks a bit like the gene map that I show for the Asian flushing syndrome. You have this solution that just kind of doesn't go anywhere. And so as someone who thinks from an evolutionary perspective, when I see a behavior that's costly, ubiquitous, and ancient, so it's been around forever, it's been around everywhere, it's costly, there are solutions to it, genetic and cultural evolutionary solutions to it, and yet we still have it. There's got to be some other factor involved. So there's got to be something on the adaptive positive side that's keeping this taste for alcohol in both our genetic and our cultural repertoires. So that's really the push of the push of the book, is to say, show that it's a mystery, and then to try to explain why we would still have this taste for alcohol.
But how did you get onto this topic from your background, right? Because you're a sinologist and you've got a background in
Yeah.
philosophy and comparative religion. What's the link?
So there's two routes actually. One has to do with what I just explained about these kind of mysteries hiding in plain sight. Because my previous work in comparative religion and cognitive science and evolution of religion has focused on religion as one of these mysteries hiding in plain sight. Right? Go anywhere, read about any culture. They're worshiping invisible beings. They're sacrificing things to them. They're cutting off foreskin of their penis and foregoing delicious foods like pork. Or they're sitting on their only day off from work. They're sitting on an uncomfortable seat all day listening to a boring sermon. So that's at the individual level, all these kind of just bizarre, costly behaviors. At a cultural level, you have things like I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the first emperor of Qin's tomb. So the Qin
No.
Shi Huangdi, he's got the terracotta army.
Yes.
So there's that they spent a pretty big chunk of GDP for about 3 or 4 years building an underground army, complete with real weapons, and the tomb was full of jade and these very valuable bronze implements. And then when the first emperor of Qin died, they killed a bunch of people and horses and threw him and all these things in the pit, and they covered it over with dirt. So they built this enormous army and buried it in the ground. Um, you got to wonder if there was, the state of Qin Prime next door that did all that work, but they built a real army instead of a terracotta army. You would expect that other Qin to outcompete the one that's wasting its resources. You'd expect a culture that invested in aqueducts and city walls to outcompete cultures that built huge temples that have no practical purpose. And yet, that's not what we see. We see that cultures that go in for religious related waste on a large scale seem to be the successful ones. So I got interested in this kind of evolutionary thinking when it came to religion, which I think, like our taste for chemical intoxicants, is a costly, ancient, ubiquitous behavior that needs to be explained. And so some of the earlier work I did with colleagues in various fields was trying to explain what are the payoffs, what are the adaptive benefits that pay for these costs when it comes to religion. So with the drunk project, I really was just taking the same set of tools and applying it to a different human behavior. And one that actually overlaps a bit with religion, because you're often doing both at the same time, chemical intoxicants and religion. And then the route, so that route is kind of my religious studies route into the project. The other connection is I worked a lot as a sinologist on this idea of wu wei, or effortless action, in early China. And there's this idea of kind of like being in the zone. You're relaxed, you're in harmony with the world, and everything's going well. People like you, you're successful. They want you to get into this state, but they face this problem which is I call the problem of trying. My first trade book was called Trying Not to Try. And it's about this problem of if you know that spontaneity is good and you're going to do
Mm.
better if you're spontaneous, how do you consciously try not to try? And I point out in that book, it's actually directly a cognitive paradox because if I tell you to relax, the part of your brain that I'm activating, prefrontal cortex, roughly, is the part we're trying to shut down. So I'm activating the part of your brain we actually want to shut down. So it's and then in the book I walk through all the ways that Chinese thinkers kind of tried to get around this cognitive paradox by distracting you, giving you something physical to do, telling you to count your breath or do meditation. So there's various ways you can use the body as a trick to get around this paradox of how do you try not to try. But
Mm.
one of these texts that I study actually tells a story about a drunken person who falls off a cart and is not harmed because his spirit is whole. He didn't know that he was riding. He doesn't know that he hasn't fall that he's fallen out. He's kind of like a baby, relaxed, um, and the text concludes by saying, if you can make your spirit whole with alcohol, how much more so if you are drunk on heaven? So it's using chemical intoxication as a metaphor for spiritual intoxication. But that story made me start to think, actually, alcohol's not bad, though. Being drunk on heaven's maybe better, but it's harder. And if you're in a situation where you need to downregulate your prefrontal cortex, you need to get into a spontaneous, relaxed state quickly, maybe alcohol is a tool for doing that. So that was another route where I started to think about alcohol as a cultural technology that we've developed to solve this problem, to solve the trying not to try problem. Basically, how do you get into a spontaneous state consciously? And one way to do it is to use a physical substance that would just go in and turn down your prefrontal cortex for you. You don't have to try to not try. The beer will do it for you over the course of an hour or so. So that was my other route into the topic.
So if we focus on religion for a second, just because you got me curious, do you think in the secular West we are underestimating the importance of what religion was doing for our societies? I mean, as it's diminishing in the West and we're sort of throwing it away, are we losing something and we're not really seeing what we're losing?
Well, I'm not. I'm part of a group of thinkers that would push back against the idea that we're throwing it away or moving away from it. Religion's really just changing form. So if you talk to people who are not religious, who don't identify with an organized religion, they're engaged in all kinds of crazy individual spiritual stuff. They believe in UFO cults or Gaia or they believe in QAnon, and so there are all these ways in which the basics of religious cognition are built into humans and they're not going anywhere. So this is what has always kind of infuriated me about like Richard Dawkins and these new atheists, is they claim to believe in science, and yet science, if you look at it, tells us that we're naturally religious. We have cognitive mechanisms that reliably kick off belief in supernatural agents, belief that there's meaning in the world, belief that there should be some narrative we can tell about events, even though, again, objectively, it's just random. So I don't think religion's disappearing. What it's doing is fragmenting. So you've got people taking a little bit of yoga here and a little Kabbalah and mixing it with some, Unitarian Christianity, and they're doing it on their own. And so one of the things that is changing, and this could be a bad thing, is we're losing some of the communal functions that religion used to have because it's become so individualized. And it's not clear what the implications of that are going to be. The group that I work with has also argued that the reason we've been free to do that, the reason that we get suddenly people inventing their own kind of mini religions, is because secular institutions have taken over some of the work that religions used to do. So there's some evidence that rule of law, effective police force, things like this, can take some of the functional pressure off of religion, and that then allows religion to kind of get looser and more individualized. So that may be something that we're seeing. But religion's never, as long as they're humans, there's going to be religion in some form. But it is changing, becoming more fragmented, more individualized, and it's not clear what the implications of that are going to be.
I suppose we also have other communication tools these days, so social media, email, telephone. So we don't necessarily need religion to mediate our interactions with someone on the other side of the country. We can do it directly through the television, let's say.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so on the topic, if we jump back into alcohol, then so how long have we been doing this for? How long have we been getting drunk?
For as long as we've been doing anything in an organized way as a species. So probably as long as there have been people, we've been seeking out fermented fruit over fermented fruit that is producing alcohol. The earliest evidence we have of actually deliberately producing alcoholic beverages is from about 13,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there's evidence in modern day Israel of beer production at a site. So we know that the Natufians, these people lived in the Fertile Crescent, so 12,000 years ago, were making alcohol. But we have evidence. So we have like a stone carving. One bit of evidence I look at in the book is this probably about 20,000-year-old stone carving. It's called the Venus of Lausanne. And it pictures this probably we don't know what it is, goddess figure drinking out of a cup, a horn. And there's no way that an artist was like, oh, I want to commemorate someone who's thirsty and was having a sip of water, right? The fact that we're portraying her drinking something means that she's drinking something interesting, something that's ritually important or, religiously important in some way. So it's almost certainly a portrayal of someone drinking an intoxicating beverage. So whether that was, wild fermented fruit or people were actually producing alcohol in a deliberate way, then we don't know. But as soon as we have evidence of people organizing and doing things together, they're making beer. So we've been doing it for a really, really long time.
But we have advertisements for people. We have Coke where someone's drinking the Coke on the billboard, right? So
yeah, that's because they're trying to sell Coke because they make money off of Coke. No one makes money off of water in the Neolithic, right? So right. It's unlikely. I mean, advertising is a completely different thing. This carving seems to be some kind of religiously significant carving, and it's got to be signifying some sort of special beverage, I think, for it to have made it to the carving stage.
And when it comes to actual hard physical evidence, like a brewery or something like this, alcohol doesn't fossilize, right? It's not the best thing to fossilize. So how do we know that amphora was holding alcohol, or that grain silo was not for food or something else?
Yeah, through chemical traces inside. So we can look at these the traces of organic molecules that are left. So that's how we know the 13,000-year-old brewery, basically in Israel, we know from chemical evidence. Then we've got kind of indirect evidence of sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern day Turkey. They had these enormous vats where they had some kind of liquid. From there we don't have enough residue to tell whether or not it was beer. But we know that people were making beer in the region at that time, so it's very likely it was. But yeah, it's people like Patrick McGovern, who's a kind of chemical paleoarchaeologist. He's the go-to guy to come when we find some vessel. He's done work in China as well, and actually been able to, through the residue, roughly reconstruct what the alcohol was made out of, and what it might have tasted like. So there's again, very early, probably 9,000 years ago, vessel from China where the chemical evidence suggests it was some kind of combination of grapes, wild grapes, some other wild fruit, honey, um, a combination of stuff that sounds actually really, really gross. I wouldn't serve this, but we can actually even recover the individual components of the alcoholic beverages.
What about in ancient Egypt and in the pyramids? Do we find alcohol next to the bodies, the pharaohs?
Yeah, so they're buried with vessels, as you see in China. I mean, the dominant grave good in ancient China is alcohol serving and consuming vessels. We know that in ancient Egypt, people were paid in beer, so laborers were paid in beer. So yeah, it's early civilizations. As soon as again, I talk in the book about this, the beer before bread hypothesis, right? So the standard story kind of motivationally is a mistake story. We drink alcohol because it triggers a reward network, and it's just hijacking for no good reason at all this reward network. The standard story about the origins of alcohol production is also a mistake story. So we got agriculture first, and then at some point someone left their sourdough starter out too long and it started to ferment, and they tried it and it made them feel good. And so we had beer. Um, this has really gotten flipped on its head by discoveries like Göbekli Tepe, where we've got hunter gatherers. This is thousands of years before there was agriculture in the region. We have hunter gatherers coming together, building these enormous ritual sites, and then feasting. So we have remains of bones of gazelles and things, and drinking something out of these big vats. And again, almost certainly beer and possibly hallucinogen laced beer. Um, so what we see is, so the suggestion is that we were making beer before we were making bread. And the motivation to settle down and start cultivating crops and turning them into more productive crops was to make more and better beer. And that actually side effect of this desire to get intoxicated. And what seems convincing about this story is that you see the same pattern around the world. So if you look around the world, the first cultivated plants seem to have been chosen for their psychoactive properties, not for their nutrition properties. And in this sense, there's a really literal sense in which our desire to get intoxicated led to civilization. It was this desire to drink that led us to start cultivating crops. So yeah, it's really at the heart, at the very beginning of human civilization.
And why not some other drug? So why not mushrooms, or why not cocaine, or mushrooms,
Yeah.
especially because they're very easy to go out and pick, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are other intoxicants. So cocaine's not an intoxicant, right? So that's not going to do the kind of work that I'm arguing alcohol does for you. But psilocybin would. It has some of the same effects. Cannabis has some of the same effects. So the two main functional things alcohol is doing for us is down-regulating the prefrontal cortex, so the cognitive part of our brain that's in charge of A to B reasoning and controlling impulses and getting to work on time. And then also boosting feel-good chemicals, serotonin, endorphins that make us like each other more and feel good about ourselves. Um, Mushrooms can do this, and cannabis can do this as well. The problem with them, and I talk about this in the book, is that, so let's talk about mushrooms first. The problem with them is they're so powerful and they so strongly dissociate you from reality that they're just not a good social drug. The main effects of alcohol, there's a lot of effects that I talk about in the book. The two most important functions are enhancing creativity and enhancing social bonding. And these go hand in hand. They're often happening at the same time. Um, Psilocybin enhances creativity, but it's so wildly depatterns our brain that it renders us completely non-functional And if you want to think of depattern the brain, Michael Pollan's talked about what psilocybin does as the cultural evolutionary equivalent of a mutagen. So in the same way you need genetic variation to get evolution to work, and mutagens will do that. Um, Taking some mushrooms is like shaking up the snow globe, right? So you get all these kind of crazy new ideas, and then some of them may get selected for if they're good ideas. Um, Psilocybin shakes up the brain so much that very little of what comes out of it is useful. Maybe
Mm,
every once in a while you get something useful, and it may be really divergent and important and creative, but 99.9% of what you get is garbage. And I talk about, actually, I talk about a personal experience with trips where I proved that truth was the color blue and thought I was going to get my PhD just handed to me for that. Um, Whereas alcohol is gentler. So it's shaking us up, it's relaxing the PFC, it's allowing crosstalk between regions of the brain,
mm,
but in a gentle way that's more likely to produce something that's useful. Um,
mm,
Also, it's an hour or two, and then you're
mm.
back to normal again. Mushrooms, you got to clear your calendar for the whole day. You're going to be doing mushrooms. So it just, mushrooms are too powerful.
But we could be
But that's why they've
microdosing, right?
I don't think we had the ability to purify the relevant. So I do talk about the fact that now that we know what the active ingredient is and we can purify it and we can precisely dose it, maybe that's going to be our new drug. Maybe
Mm,
microdosing psilocybin is going to be the way to go. But we just with in the natural form in mushrooms, it's too unpredictable how concentrated stuff is. It just wasn't useful enough as a predictable, dosable intoxicant. And that is also the problem with cannabis. So cannabis is kind of on the power level similar to alcohol. It's not wildly depatterning us the way psilocybin is. But the two big problems with cannabis are dosing.
mm,
So if you're smoking it, you've got to know how to hold it in your lungs. And if people are holding it in different ways, you're going to get different doses. If you're eating it, the delay between when you eat it and when the effects happen is so long that it's notoriously hard to dose, right? People always do this where they take some edibles and 3 hours later they're like, I'm not feeling anything. They take some more, and then suddenly they took way too much. So it's just hard to dose in a way that alcohol is not. If you're drinking a
mm,
beer that your culture has been producing for 20 generations, you know exactly what you're getting when you drink it. The other, I think, the really more important difference is cannabis intoxication has really different effects on different people.
mm,
So, I had friends in grad school who would smoke and then want to dance or talk about philosophy, or it make them very social and active and creative. Universally, I've tried, and because I live in Canada, I can walk into a cannabis shop and get any strain of cannabis in any concentration. I've tried it every delivery method possible. 100%, it makes me super paranoid and then I fall asleep.
mm,
It's a useless drug for me. It's
mm,
very dysphoric and then I fall asleep. And I know other people like this. So it just cannabis has varying effects across individuals in a way that
mm,
alcohol doesn't. So alcohol has pretty much the same effects across different individuals. So
mm,
um, there's a reason, and it's a shame because actually both psilocybin and cannabis are better drugs in a way. They're much less harmful
mm,
physiologically, and I think crucially, neither one of them is physically addictive.
mm,
Unlike alcohol, alcohol is kind of up there with heroin. Okay, it's really physically addictive, which is one of the things that makes it so dangerous. Um, but there's a reason in kind of the cultural evolutionary war between different intoxicants to become the favorite one of human beings. There's a reason alcohol won.
mm,
It's easy to make, it's easy to dose, it has predictable effects across individuals. It's got a very short half-life in our body because we have this machinery that we inherited from primate ancestors to break down ethanol. Um, it's not a perfect drug, but it's the best one we've come up with so far
mm.
for the job it's
Does
supposed to do.
but not all cultures use alcohol, right? There are alternatives like kava and things like this. Are there alternatives that give you the benefits of alcohol without the dangers, or we just don't have something that fills this role?
No, no, not yet, which is a shame. I wish we did. But kava, yeah, kava is interesting. I talk about in the book. It's used in parts of the Pacific where they don't have alcohol. And it's puzzling why they don't have alcohol because alcohol is known in the region.
Hmm.
And my colleague Joe Henrich's theory is that these are also areas in the Pacific where ciguatera poisoning is a problem. So this poisoning you get
Hmm.
from eating reef fish who are building up this plankton that can be toxic. Alcohol and ciguatera poisoning have a really bad interaction. So if you have had some ciguatera in you and you drink alcohol, it's really bad for you. So he thinks that the kava, if you look at the kava map, it almost maps exactly onto the ciguatera map. So he thinks it's a cultural adaptation to, hey, we need some intoxicant to do this job, but we can't use alcohol because of the reef fish. So we're going to chew this kind of gross tuber instead and spit into a communal bowl. And but it's interesting that, when you take alcohol out of the equation for some reason, so in this case, because maybe the local fish interact negatively with it, um, people come up with some other intoxicant that's going to basically do the same job as best as it can.
So on the topic of creativity, since that's what you mentioned to start with, it seems odd to me that you'd want to switch off a bit of your brain to become more creative, right? So, and I know it's often said that without alcohol, we wouldn't have all the music and all the arts that we see. But does it really make people more creative also in STEM and sort of engineering and these sort of hard areas of society that we need to get forward as a society? Or
Yeah, absolutely. It is. So evolution had a trade-off when it came to the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is a weird part of the brain, right? It's the last part of you as a human that develops, so it doesn't fully mature until you're in your mid 20s, which is weird, right? Because you've been sexually mature at that point for a really long time, but you still don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. Again, when look at things from an evolutionary perspective, something weird is going on there. So evolution's slow walking the development of the PFC. Why? I think it's because you need to be a functioning adult, you do need a PFC.
mm-hmm.
You need to be able to get up on time, get to work. You need to remain focused. So the PFC is good for keeping you on task. If you're doing a task, certain types of coding, certain types of tool making are something you need a PFC for because you got to move from A to B to C to D without getting distracted, without getting bored. That's what the PFC is for. So it's good for laser focus. It's good for A to B to C type
Mm-hmm.
behaviors. And it's helped by stimulants. So caffeine, nicotine, cocaine will help with that. Meth will help with that, right? It helps you give you energy and stay focused on a task in the
Mm-hmm.
right doses. There are certain types of tasks, though, where you're not moving from A to B to C. You need to come up with Z way over here. You need what's called divergent creativity, or lateral thinking, it's sometimes called. You need to actually come up with something completely new. A to B to C is not, you're running into a wall. You need something completely new. That's where the PFC actually gets in the way. It's unhelpful. And so one of the things I look at in the book is this work by Alison Gopnik, it's a developmental psychologist at Berkeley. And she's done these very, very clever creativity studies where she gives people tasks that you can't solve A to B to C. You need to come up with a divergent solution to it. And what she finds is that little kids are great at these. They solve them right away. And our ability to solve them goes down in a linear fashion as we age. And in the book, I lay the graph of declining creativity on top of a graph of the maturation of the prefrontal cortex. And it's basically tracking the same thing. So as we get a prefrontal cortex, we become less able to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Allison's conclusion from this is, oh, well, kids are like the R&D part of the human race. They're the creative types, and adults are boring. But I don't think that's the takeaway, because kids are creative, but they're also kind of useless. Like I've never heard of a 4-year-old coming up with a decent patent idea, right? They come up with dumb stuff because they're kids. They don't know what's important. And so I think the takeaway is really, how do you get adults who have the skills and the knowledge to come up with creative solutions to actually useful things? How do you get them to think like kids again, to get back to
Mm.
that kind of creative flexibility we had when we were kids? And that's one of the things alcohol does. So by downregulating the PFC, you're basically just taking people back to an earlier developmental stage when their brain regions communicated more freely because the PFC wasn't in charge at that point. So it's a way, having a couple beers and sitting down and talking through a problem is a way to kind of get back to this creative, more flexible mindset, but temporarily. And then it wears off and you're a grown up again and you can actually implement the solution you came up with. So it for certain types of tasks, we do want to take out a part of our brain because it interferes with this kind of lateral insight creativity.
Does it also turn on our play circuits, right? Because kids love running around and playing, and people
Yeah.
do become more playful when they're drinking. Is that also an
Yeah.
aspect?
Yeah, so that's the other it's depressing parts of our brain. So it's depressing the prefrontal cortex first, and then later on motor systems, which is why you shouldn't drive. Um, but it's boosting serotonin, endorphins, these things that make us playful and happy and want to explore. They make us exploratory, right? So they're boosting these things that the net effect is to make us more childlike overall. And also in these kind of trusting ways, we're more open to other people, we're more social, we're more socially curious. So it's doing both of those things at the same time.
You know, there are these famous anecdotes. I don't know if they're true about ancient Persians. They would, if they had an important decision, they would, they would look at the decision once while they're sober, and then while they're drunk a second time. And if it passed both the sober and the drunk tests, then they would go ahead with the decision. And then you hear about, for example, Churchill was renowned for drinking. And in China, I've heard that over business discussions, people are often intoxicated or drinking while they're having business negotiations. So why do we want to turn off our prefrontal cortex when it comes to important decisions, to building collaborations, to this sort of cohesive group dynamic sort of thinking?
Yeah, so that's the other big effect of alcohol. So one is enhancing individual and group creativity. And the other one is helping people get over cooperation problems, trust problems, and bond socially in a certain kind of way. So, when I'm old enough to remember when this was invented, Skype, when we first had video conferencing. And I can remember people predicting, well, business travel is going to just disappear because why would I fly from London to Shanghai to meet in person with people if I can just Skype and sign the contract over the internet? And yet it took a global pandemic to have any effect on business travel. And now that the pandemic's over, people are traveling again. And that's because if you're doing anything more complicated than buying some paper clips from someone, you want to sit down with them and drink and eat and get a sense of them. So why is that? This is where I have to, probably the most technically difficult part of the book was I had to take a little diversion into game theory and talk about cooperation dilemmas without losing my general reader. But the humans are weird, right? In a couple ways. One is this dependence we have on technology and creativity, which is why we need this creativity aid. The other is that we cooperate on a scale and with an intensity that looks more like social insects than primates, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's weird. We're related to chimpanzees, but chimpanzees don't cooperate with strangers. They don't cooperate outside of kin. or individuals who are known to them. You try to put Sarah Blaffer Hardy famously said, you try to put a bunch of chimpanzees on an airplane. At the other end, you just have a tube full of blood and body parts, right? It would just tear each other apart. And yet we sit and we eat our peanuts and we put our seatbelt on. And so we're remarkably cooperative for a primate. And we're cooperating with strangers all the time. When we do that, we open ourselves up to being taken advantage of. So our daily lives and our public lives are full of prisoner's dilemma situations. These cooperation dilemmas go by different names: prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of the commons, common good problem. But basically, the structure is everybody does better if we trust each other and cooperate. Mm-hmm. As an individual, I get a better payoff if I temporarily suppress my individual needs and cooperate with the group. But in doing that middle part, I'm opening myself up to what economists call defection, right? I'm opening myself up to the possibility that you won't cooperate. And if you defect and I cooperate, I'm going to be worse off actually in the end. And so in prisoner dilemma situations, the only rational strategy is to not cooperate. It's to defect and protect yourself. And yet in real life, people solve prisoners' dilemmas all the time, effortlessly. And except for, in economic games with students, the only ones who don't are economists and philosophers. It's the only people who don't cooperate. But normal people cooperate all the time. And there's various ways we do this. We trust people. But one of my arguments is a function of alcohol is to cultures have an interest in making cooperation possible. So they want to put their thumb on the scale to favor cheater detectors over cheaters. And I argue in the book that if you look at humans, the ability that we have to look at someone's face and say they're bored with this conversation, they want to move on, they're chatting to me, but they really want to talk to that person across the room and they're just waiting for a chance. We're supernaturally good. A chimpanzee would think it was magic, the way I can just look at your face and hear your tone of voice and know all the stuff about what's going on inside you. It would seem like magic. These type of abilities typically are driven by these kind of evolutionary ramping up. So you've got some kind of competition going. You see a super fast gazelle that runs way faster than it should. There's some reason for that, and it's probably because there was a predator that was about as fast. So there's this North American gazelle that runs ridiculously fast, and no one was sure why until we found the fossil remains of the thing it was running from. So it's still running from the ghost of this predator. Humans have been locked in this evolutionary arms race where if I can read your facial signals, things that are hard for you to control, right? Your tone of voice, micro expressions in your face. If I can figure out if you're really trustworthy or not doing that, that's great for me. But also, if you can fake those things, it's great for you. You can be a defector without anyone knowing you're a defector. So we're constantly sussing each other out. Evolution wants to make it easier. Cultural evolution wants to make it easier for us to tell cheaters ahead of time. And this is what alcohol is doing. So if I'm entering into a negotiation with you, we're going to have a treaty, we're going to stop fighting, I'm going to marry my daughter to your son and we'll live in peace, and I'm really sincere about that. If I'm actually bullshitting you and I'm planning to ambush you afterwards, or I have something else going on the side, I have to bifurcate my brain. I have to keep simultaneously in my brain what I know to be true and also what I'm telling you is true. I have to suppress any emotional expression or anything that has to do with what I know to be true. And I have to fake expressions that go along with the thing I'm telling you is true. That's a PFC. That's what the PFC is designed for, is that kind of cognitive control, right? So lying to someone is a PFC heavy operation. when if in before we have this conversation, we sit down and do a couple shots or drink some beer for a while, I've basically eliminated my ability to do that or severely
Mm.
degraded my ability to do that. So I compare the drinking in this kind of social context to when we shake hands and show that we're not carrying a weapon in our dominant hand. I'm unarmed. If I sit down and drink with you first, I'm basically like taking my prefrontal cortex out and putting it on the table and saying, you can trust me because my ability to bullshit you has been seriously degraded.
Mm.
At the same time, that other effect of alcohol, the boosting of serotonin, endorphins, makes me less likely to want to cheat you. Suddenly I'm like, you know what? I like this guy. Marrying my daughter to his son's great idea. We're going to be great together. It's creating bonding where it didn't exist before. So I think that's the other really crucial. So, you see this in every scale from kind of high level negotiations between states all the way down to, people on a first date or getting to
Mm.
know your neighbor. We just use alcohol as a social lubricant because it's making us more trustworthy, it's making us more trusting, and it's making us more cooperative and more likely to bond with other people. So that's the other really crucial function that alcohol has been playing historically for us.
I find it really amazing that we're not, at least I'm not fully aware, I'm not cognizant of these functions that alcohol is doing. It's pleasurable, right? So people do
Yeah.
it in social scenarios because it's pleasurable. We spoke about this a little bit earlier. Do you think it's pleasurable just by chance, or is it that our bodies recognize that in some evolutionary sense, alcohol is doing work and so it makes alcohol pleasurable?
I think it probably just really does trigger a reward network in our brains because it also non-human animals also find intoxication pleasurable,
Hmm.
and they don't need these functions, right? They're not negotiating treaties or having to invent new tools. So I think probably what got it off the ground is a kind of byproduct story. It does trigger
Hmm.
reward networks in our brain, but that can't be what kept it in our gene pool, right? So I think there's a bit of truth to the hijack story, the idea that it's hijacking a reward network, but that can't be the whole story because there's got to be functional benefits that keep the pleasure in our systems when evolution has the tools it needs to make it very unpleasurable for us to do it. So I think we do it because it makes us feel good. We also do it because I think we have a it's not random when we drink. We don't just randomly drink throughout the day, right? Because it feels good. We drink to mark a transition from work to leisure. So we come home and we pour ourselves a drink because it's now time for a different part of our day. Um, we drink to welcome new people to our organization or to meet potential new colleagues and feel relaxed about them. So I think people have an intuitive sense of these functions. I think we know at some level, oh, alcohol is good for this thing,
Hmm.
but it hasn't been articulated. And so when people read the book are like, oh yeah, this makes sense. And I think we know it. But because we're not articulate about it, we're not we when you're not articulate about a function, you don't really understand it. You need to really lay it out. And especially if you're needing to defend it against people who are focused on the costs. And so I
Hmm.
think that our public discussions about alcohol have been focused exclusively on the costs, social
Hmm.
costs and health costs. And no one's been kind of sticking up for the functional benefits, even though we kind of know they're there because no one's really laid them out before. So what I'm trying to do in the book is take these, I think, common sense intuitions we have about what alcohol is good for. You see cultures talking about these things directly or indirectly, but really laying them out and then providing scientific evidence for them. And
Hmm.
that then once you're articulate about what the functions are, then you're in a position to actually make intelligent decisions about whether or not because you may end up saying, yeah, it's good for these things, but I still don't want to use alcohol because I have a whatever family history of alcoholism, or in my organization, I want to use some other way to build teams and make people relax. But at least once you're articulate about what the functions are, you can make intelligent decisions about the costs and benefits and trade-offs involved.
I want to ask you about prohibition in a second, but uh, there's another aspect that I find quite curious, and that is our perception of drinking really depends on who is doing the drinking, right? So if you imagine someone who's really successful, maybe a rock star, someone like this, then drinking and doing drugs and being wild in this sort of a way can be seen as being sexy even, right? Whereas if you see someone who's really struggling with life, someone who's maybe homeless or has various problems, if they're drinking, we view it in a very, very different way, right? It's very unattractive. And so it makes me wonder if alcohol is somehow also, it's like it signals that we're able to take this risk. It's like a peacock's tail, something like this, right? Where you say, I am robust, I am healthy enough that I can intoxicate myself and everything will be fine. Is there something along these lines that you also explore in the book?
I look a little bit at so most of the benefits I talk about come at moderate levels of intoxication. So they tend to peak around zero point zero 0.08 blood alcohol content, so about 2 beers in. Um, One of the things I talk about briefly is serious intoxication. So when you get really drunk to a point that you're seriously impairing yourself, that seems to not make sense in terms of the adaptive story that I'm telling. So it may just be a function of the fact that we have access to this crazy new form of alcohol that we never had before, distilled liquors, which are just wildly more powerful than anything we've been drinking historically. So, and we've only had them for a couple hundred years compared to whatever 13,000 for beer. Um, but it could be that it's a kind of costly signaling that it may help with bonding. So I do talk about this Navy SEAL commander who, at the end of a training, would take his team out, and they get really wasted, like way past zero point zero 0.08. And there is something where I think the signal is, I care about you all so much that I'm going to do this thing that I know is going to make me feel really bad in the morning. And I'm going to make myself super vulnerable where I, can barely walk and I'm slurring my words because that's how much I trust you. There may be some signaling going on there that is important for certain types of group bonding. Um, but it's a tricky thing. I wanted to focus on more moderate drinking because I think that's really historically what we've been doing. And I think in the case of the rock star versus someone who's on the street and how we we react to visible drunkenness differently, I think the difference is the rock star is channeling it successfully. So we value that, or we, at least don't condemn it as much because we're like, oh, well, they're harnessing their creativity in a way that's made them successful, whereas the person who's homeless is not. So they're intoxicating themselves, but not producing anything useful, and it's maybe harming them. And maybe they need a little bit more A to B to C thinking. So I think that's why we react differently in those two cases. Artists, people are able to use intoxication successfully. We recognize that as one strategy that's possible for people in a culture.
So right at the start of our discussion, you mentioned regions in the world where there's prohibition. So in particular in Islamic countries and in Christendom, let's say. The one question I have is that, these groups do seem successful. Some very large percentage of the world belong to Abrahamic religions, and even if there's these cultures definitely restrict drinking. Even if there still is drinking, they do heavily restrict it. So if drinking is so beneficial and has all these benefits, why do we see the predominance of these religions?
Well, first of all, they're not very predominant. And Christian prohibition is a really recent thing. You look at historical Christianity, wine is awesome. It's Jesus's first miracle is turning water into wine, right? Wine is the most sacred sacrament of Christianity. So Christianity has been very pro alcohol for most of its history. It's this recent interesting development, and really primarily in English speaking world, where you have these evangelical forms of Christianity that are anti-alcohol, and you have these kind of Christian offshoots like the Church of the Latter-day Saints, who are, the Mormons are actually very consistent prohibitionists. Um, I think there's a couple things going on here. One is part of the function of a religious group prohibiting alcohol isn't so much about the prohibiting alcohol, it's about signaling something about themselves. So one of the arguments about early Islam and why, the alcohol prohibition wasn't part of early Islam either. They were drinking originally. One of the arguments about why they adopted it is they were surrounded by these wine drinking cultures in the Mediterranean. And this was a signal that, hey, look, we're different. We don't consume the substance. You see this with the Mormons. If this is a functional thing to avoid intoxication, it's weird that they also ban caffeine, right? Why wouldn't you drink? Coffee is super functional. Why wouldn't you keep drinking coffee? That combined with the unusual underwear and the other kind of things they do that are different, suggests that it's part of a package of both signaling to the outside world, we're different from you. That helps you maintain your identity in a world where you're surrounded by other groups. It's also a costly display that you're making as an in-group member to show everyone that you really take this seriously, because alcohol's fun. It feels good. So if I'm denying myself that, it's very much like denying myself work or sitting in an uncomfortable chair for 3 hours on my day off. I'm doing something unpleasant to show that I really take the group seriously. So I think in many cases, alcohol prohibition is really it's a costly signal. It's not that these groups are getting rid of the function for no reason. The other thing you see is that groups that, for whatever reason, ban alcohol often then figure out another way to get the same thing. So Pentecostals ban alcohol, but they do these long prayer sessions where they sing and they dance and they stand up and they sit down and they bow and they kneel, and then they start speaking in tongues and handling snakes. They have these experiences that look like drunkenness. And in fact, the first Pentecostals, in the New Testament, these people who are speaking in tongues, passers-by think that they're drunk. They think that they've been drinking. And I forget who it's, St. Paul or Peter says, no, they're drunk on the Holy Spirit, not on wine. So there are other ways to get the same effect as alcohol. You want to downregulate the PFC, you want to upregulate serotonin and endorphin. You can use extended singing and dancing. You can use pain will do it. Sleep deprivation will do it. Extreme exercise will do it. So the runner's high is basically putting you into a drunken state because you're so stressing your body that your body is like, okay, don't need the PFC anymore. We really need all energy going to the lungs and the heart. And the endorphins get stimulated. And so there are other ways to do it. And so it's revealing to me that groups that ban alcohol often come up with other techniques for getting you into a kind of intoxicated state. And those work. It's just, as I say in the book, basically, these other techniques work, but they're kind of a hassle. Like if I have a choice between I want to get into the state with you, and my choice is you and I are going to sit down and have a couple IPAs, or we're going to run laps and flagellate ourselves for 3 hours. It's like, I'm going to go with the IPAs. So that's why, you can do it other ways, but alcohol is just so efficient and pleasant and fast that's why it's still not the standard response to ban it. These groups
Mm.
that do ban it are rare, remain rare.
Mm. So in the West, it's illegal, for instance, in most places to use cocaine, right? But there's many
Mhm.
people who still do it. And people are taking illegal drugs all the time in the West. When it comes to Islam, I have this picture that is just alcohol, no, right? It's out. But what does it actually look like on the ground? So when you do the research and you mentioned that it's much smaller the regions that really prohibit it than you'd imagine. So what is the story?
The story in Islam is all sorts of wild violations of prohibition on alcohol. So our most famous, beautiful wine poetry comes from Persia, Islamic Persia, when in theory alcohol was not allowed, and they were writing these poems about wine. The typical pattern is elites are flouting this all the time. And Saudi Arabia notoriously, elites have these private parties with alcohol, or they fly to parts of elsewhere where they can party in private without people bothering them. So it's widely flouted in practice, and so that's why you have to be really careful about saying, well, Islam prohibits alcohol. In theory, they do, but people are actually drinking quite a bit in most places, in many places. But you do still have to explain groups like the Mormons, Church of Latter Day Saints, who seem to be taking pretty hardcore, and Pentecostals. So there are groups that really do enforce it and get very upset with people who violate it. And so you do have to explain those groups.
So when it comes to your book, you have a subtitle that's fairly provocative, right? It's How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. And so what I'd like to know is what you actually believe, what your actual hypothesis is. Do you think, for instance, that without alcohol we wouldn't have civilization? Where would we be without alcohol?
Yeah, it's hard to do counterfactuals like that. But I think that I think it would have been very difficult to get civilization off the ground without something very much like alcohol, some sort of intoxicant that was serving this function. But it wasn't doing the job by itself. It was doing the job along with religion, which is this other technology we developed for. A lot of my work has looked at the puzzle of our transition from small scale societies where we live more like our primate ancestors to large scale societies where we're living a very different lifestyle. We're cooperating with strangers, we're regulating ourselves in ways we never had to before. How did that transition happen? And I think that religion was part of it, but I also think that chemical intoxicants, primary among them alcohol, was crucial. And I think that if we suddenly today lost alcohol, we would lose a lot. We would lose this substance that still serves these really important functions for us. So I take quite seriously the positive claim that I'm making that alcohol has been a crucial tool for humans to move from small scale societies to civilization. Um, and I think once we realize that, um, we can we're better able to contextualize what the role of intoxicants today should be. We don't need them as much anymore, right? I don't need to suss you out is in the same way I used to have to because we now have contracts and courts and I can sue you if you cheat me and I have some legal protections. So in large scale societies with strong institutions, I don't think we need some of these functions as much as we used to. And as I point out in the book, alcohol has become a lot more dangerous than it used to be historically. It's much more powerful. And we also have private access to it, which is historically unprecedented. Alcohol was always consumed ritually, communally, in ways that helped us to regulate our consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now I can, drive through a liquor store and have them load my car up with cases of tequila and take it home and just have it in my house. That's crazy. So there are these new dangers in the modern world that alcohol presents that may kind of make us a little more worried about using it the way we historically have. But we need to see that there's a reason the taste for intoxication has remained in our cultural repertoires for so long. And once we see the whole functional picture, then we can actually make intelligent decisions as individuals or groups, so whether or not alcohol is going to be part of our lives, and then what role it's going to play.
It's interesting. I've read that there is some evidence that younger generations are drinking less. Do you think, if that's true, do you think that's because the risk profile is changing? Right now we have spirits as opposed to beers. We've got cars that we can crash, and we have other tools, right? So we have these communication tools, as you just mentioned. Is that what's happening there?
Maybe, yeah. I think part of it too is the messaging on the health dangers has become clearer. So in my generation, it was still plausible that physiologically, at least wine consumption was a net positive, good for cholesterol and the French paradox and all that. And that's been pretty much, I think the medical consensus now is that is completely outweighed by carcinogenic properties and liver damage. And so I think young people are getting clearer messaging that alcohol is dangerous physiologically. But I think part of it's just this kind of the churn that you get with generations where just kids don't want to do what their parents do. So I think part of it's just, cannabis is legal now. Cannabis is much cooler than alcohol. I think it's partly just a trend thing. And I expect it to change in the same way that whatever, my daughter now wears these, she calls them high-waisted mom pants are back in fashion again. And, hopefully that'll last for a few years and then we'll go back to wearing normal pants again. So I think part of it's just fashion trends. Alcohol's not fashionable right now as a drug. Everyone's into microdosing and, cannabis instead, or being, sober and conscious and aware and going to sober bars. But I do think this is somewhat cyclical. And so part of it is better understanding the dangers of alcohol. Part of it may be a recognition of how dangerous alcohol has become. But I think part of it's just fashion.
So on that note, let's wrap up the conversation with a final question about how we should be using alcohol. So how should we use it as a culture and individually?
We should, first of all, emulate cultures that seem to use it better than others. So I talk in the book about what anthropologists call northern versus southern drinking cultures, and they're talking about Europe here. So northern European cultures, and this includes Eastern Europe, they drink distilled liquors primarily. They drink to get drunk. They drink outside of the context of meals. They tend to drink in single-sex groups. Alcohol's forbidden to children. It's kind of a taboo thing, so you don't do it at all, but then you do lots of it. This is a recipe for binge drinking and unhealthy drinking. If you look at Southern European cultures, so think of like Italy, Spain, they drink primarily wine and beer. They always and only drink in the context of a meal, so lunch or dinner, where it's everyone, the whole family. It's old people, young people, the dogs, the kids. Kids get a little bit of wine. So my ex-wife is half Italian, and so my daughter grew up going to Italy every summer and getting a little bit of wine at the dinner table, watered down, but it just sends a signal that this is a normal part of life. It adds to the pleasure of a meal. You don't get drunk. So getting visibly drunk where you're stumbling or you're slurring your words is shameful. It's shameful in a Southern culture, where it's actually a kind of badge of pride in a Northern culture. Kids learn that alcohol is just a normal part of a meal, drunk in moderation. And when the meal's over and you leave the meal table, the drinking is over. So you don't And I remember I wasn't raised in the Southern drinking culture. And so I remember the first time we went to visit relatives in Italy and I was drinking this amazing Italian red because I was coming from Canada where you can't get wine here at all. So I was like, this is amazing. And I wanted to take a glass up with me to take notes on it because it was so good. And so I topped my wine glass off and went to go upstairs with it to the bedroom. And I remember my mother-in-law at the time looking at me like, what's wrong with you? You're an alcoholic. Why would you take wine upstairs with you? You don't take alcohol away from the meal table. And these are all kind of tricks to help you drink moderately and to capture all the benefits of sociality and kind of creativity around the table, talking with people, while mitigating the possible downsides. And what you see is that, at least until recently, I think Italy had the highest per capita alcohol consumption in Europe, but they had some of the lowest alcoholism rates. So culture matters and can be protective. And interesting, I've been trying to track down this citation. I read it somewhere and I didn't write it down. But someone looked at, I love this because it's controlling for genes. So maybe Italians just are genetically different and they can drink safely. But Italians moved to the US and within a generation, their alcoholism rates spike and go up to American levels. So they lose the culture, they lose the protective thing. So I think one thing we can do is just try to copy culturally successful strategies. Drink mainly beer and wine, be very cautious about distilled liquors. Italians drink them, but in very small quantities as a digestivo or aperitivo before or after a meal. Only drink around a meal at the meal table. Only drink with other people. Drinking alone, one takeaway from the book is drinking alone is historically really unusual and super dangerous because alcohol is so pleasurable and so addictive that as an individual, I think you're putting too much pressure on yourself to control your drinking safely when you're just by yourself. So drink socially, and be mindful of when you're using it and why. This is, I'm using it now because these are new people and I want to relax and be open to them. If you're aware of kind of also why you're using it, it will help you decide what's an appropriate scenario and what's not. So just be more mindful. That would be my general advice. Emulate the Italians and be more mindful.
Edward Slingerland, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.